In the darkest corners of the historical imagination, it has a name whispered with a unique blend of horror and morbid fascination: the breast ripper. Sometimes it's called the iron spider. The name changes, but the image it conjures is brutally consistent. Picture it: a set of cold, heavy iron claws, often fashioned into a pincer, their interior lined with unforgiving spikes. It is a tool whose shape communicates its function with sickening clarity. It was designed to be heated, clamped onto a woman's breast, and then pulled violently. It was an instrument engineered not merely to inflict pain, but to maim, to unmake, to permanently destroy a part of a woman's body, leaving a punishment etched into her very flesh for as long as she survived it. It stands as perhaps the ultimate symbol of a barbaric age's cruelty, a piece of nightmare technology reserved specifically for the female form. And it forces us to ask a chilling question: what sin, what crime against God or man, could possibly demand such a uniquely horrifying retribution? Was it for the woman accused of adultery, her body branded for a passion deemed illicit? Was it for the one who sought to end an unwanted pregnancy, her punishment a grotesque parody of motherhood? Or was it reserved for the heretic, the witch, whose feminine power was seen as a direct threat to the patriarchal order of the church and state? The possibilities themselves paint a terrifying picture of the medieval world. The device is the perfect, gruesome icon of historical misogyny, a tangible manifestation of an era's deepest fears and hatreds directed at women. But what if I told you that the most terrifying thing about this device isn't how it was used, but that in the Middle Ages it probably wasn't used at all? What if I told you that this ultimate symbol of female torture, this icon of medieval barbarism that appears in museums and horror films, may have never even existed during that time? This is not the story you think it is. We are not here to simply recoil at a ghost story forged in iron. We are here to conduct an investigation. We are about to place a legend on the operating table and dissect it piece by piece. Because in peeling back the myth of the breast ripper, we uncover something far more disturbing: the documented, systematic, and often silent horror that women truly endured. The truth is that the real instruments of terror were not always made of metal, and the real nightmare is not what might have happened, but what we know for certain did. Join me as we unmask a phantom, only to find a legion of real demons hiding in its shadow. Our investigation begins with a simple, yet profoundly disruptive question: where's the proof? For an instrument supposedly used to mete out official, legal punishments, its presence in the historical record of the Middle Ages is a complete and deafening silence. If you journey into the vast archives of medieval law, into the court records that meticulously documented punishments from fines to executions, you will find no mention of it. You will not find a single legal code from any European kingdom that prescribes the use of a breast ripper or iron spider for any crime. You will find detailed descriptions of hangings, burnings, brandings, and beheadings. You will find laws detailing the precise nature of public shaming rituals. But of this specific device there is nothing. It is a ghost in the legal machine. Let's turn then from the written word to the cold, hard earth. What about the archaeological record? Surely a tool of such specific and brutal design would leave a trace. Archaeologists have unearthed countless artifacts from the medieval period: weapons, tools, household items, and yes, even instruments of torture and execution. We have found shackles, manacles, and the physical remains of brutalized skeletons. Yet, not a single confirmed breast ripper has ever been excavated from an authentic medieval site. The claws and pincers that adorn museum walls were not pulled from the dirt of a 13th century castle dungeon. They were pulled from the workshops of much, much later eras. So, if the device is absent from the laws and the soil of the Middle Ages, where did this powerful and pervasive legend come from? The trail does not lead us back to the so-called Dark Ages, but forward to the Age of Enlightenment and the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was during this period that the modern world, celebrating its own perceived progress in science, reason, and human rights, looked back at the Middle Ages and needed a villain. The medieval period was recast as the Dark Ages, a monolithic block of 1,000 years defined by superstition, ignorance, and unrestrained brutality. To make themselves look enlightened, they had to paint the past in the darkest shades imaginable. And what better way to do that than to invent, or at least dramatically embellish, its instruments of cruelty? This is where our phantom begins to take shape. The first known descriptions and illustrations of the breast ripper appear not in medieval manuscripts, but in books published in the late 1700s and 1800s. One of the most famous examples comes from a 1790s travelogue by a British writer named John Howard, who described seeing such a device in Vienna, claiming it was used for punishing blasphemy. From there, the legend grew, fueled by the burgeoning Gothic horror genre, which reveled in tales of haunted castles, inquisitorial dungeons, and sadistic monks. The breast ripper was the perfect prop for this new, sensationalized vision of the past. It was visually shocking, thematically potent, and perfectly aligned with the narrative of a barbaric past that the modern world had thankfully escaped. This hunger for a horrifying past created a commercial market. Enterprising collectors and showmen, figures like the infamous P.T. Barnum, understood that the public craved the grotesque. In the 19th century, a cottage industry emerged, creating and selling authentic medieval torture devices to museums and private collectors who asked few questions. It was far easier and more profitable to have a blacksmith forge a terrifying-looking set of iron claws based on a lurid illustration than it was to conduct rigorous historical research. Many of the iron spiders you might see in a torture museum today are not historical artifacts, but historical theater, products of the 19th century imagination, not the 15th century legal system. They are Victorian nightmares about a medieval world, not artifacts from it. This brings us to the psychological core of our investigation. Why do we want to believe in the breast ripper so badly? Why has this specific legend endured with such tenacity? The answer is as unsettling as the device itself. First, it offers a simple, horrifying symbol for a complex and nuanced reality. The systemic oppression of women throughout history is a vast, sprawling topic woven from law, religion, economics, and social norms. It's hard to visualize. The breast ripper, however, is brutally simple. It condenses that entire system of oppression into a single, easily understood object of terror. It's a cognitive shortcut that allows us to grasp the horror of misogyny without having to grapple with its intricate and often mundane mechanics. We can point to the iron claw and say, "That is what misogyny looks like," and feel like we understand. Second, the myth satisfies a dark curiosity while simultaneously flattering our modern sensibilities. It allows us to peer into the abyss of human cruelty from a safe distance, to feel a thrill of horror while reassuring ourselves that we are not like them. We can look at this barbaric tool and feel a sense of progress and superiority. We have evolved. We are civilized. We would never do such a thing. The legend of the breast ripper allows us to construct a monster out of the past so that we can feel safer in the present. It turns history into a horror movie where we are the lucky survivors who get to walk out of the theater at the end. The conclusion of this part of our investigation is therefore unavoidable. The iron spider is not a relic of medieval justice. It is a ghost, a forgery, a piece of propaganda created centuries later to serve a different agenda. But debunking this myth does not close the book on female suffering. In fact, it does the opposite. By clearing away this sensationalized phantom, we are forced to confront a far more insidious and well-documented reality. We are forced to open the door to a darker room, a room filled not with fantastical iron claws, but with the quiet, legal, and socially sanctioned tools of control and humiliation that were used on women every single day. The nightmare, it turns out, was real. It just looked different. If the iron spider was a phantom, what was the reality? If women weren't being threatened with fantastical ripping claws, what real instruments of terror did they face? The truth is that the medieval and early modern periods possessed an entire arsenal of punishments designed to control women, not through the lurid, bloody spectacle of a device like the breast ripper, but through something often more potent and enduring: public humiliation. The goal was not always to break the body, but to shatter the soul, to destroy a woman's place within her community, which, in that world, was a form of death in itself. Let us first examine one of the most widespread and psychologically astute instruments of this arsenal, the scold's bridle, sometimes known as the brank. Imagine not a tool of laceration, but of silence. It was a heavy iron cage, a sort of muzzle, that was locked over a woman's head. It was cumbersome, cold, and dehumanizing. But its true genius, its true cruelty, lay in a small piece of metal attached to the front. A plate, often covered in sharp spikes or shaped into a gag, that was forced into the mouth and pressed down upon the tongue. It made speech impossible, and even the attempt to speak would result in agonizing pain. And what was the crime that warranted such a punishment? It wasn't murder, it wasn't treason, it wasn't theft or heresy. The primary crime punished by the scold's bridle was a uniquely female one in the eyes of the patriarchal authorities, the crime of speaking too much. It was a punishment for the scold, the nag, the gossip. It was for the woman who argued with her husband, who spoke ill of her neighbors, or who dared to publicly challenge the decisions of male authorities, be it a priest or a magistrate. It was a tool designed to physically enforce the social expectation that women should be meek, subservient, and above all, quiet. The horror of the bridle was not confined to the physical pain it inflicted. Its true power was in the ritual of public shame. A woman fitted with the bridle would be paraded through the streets of her town, often led by a rope held by a town official or even her own husband. She would be subjected to the jeers, the ridicule, and the contempt of her entire community, the very people she had to live and interact with every day. Children would point and laugh. Neighbors would whisper and judge. It was an exercise in systematic dehumanization. By placing this iron cage on her head, the authorities transformed her from a person into a spectacle, an animal to be mocked. The message was brutally clear. Your voice, your opinions, your very identity as a thinking, speaking individual is not valid. It is a malfunction that must be corrected through pain and public disgrace. The bridle was not just an instrument of torture. It was an instrument of social control, designed to police the very words that came out of women's mouths. Now, let us turn from the silencing of the tongue to a punishment that threatened the entire body: the ducking stool. Picture a sturdy wooden armchair, hardly threatening on its own. Now, attach that chair to the end of a long, heavy wooden beam, balanced on a fulcrum like a giant seesaw. The entire apparatus was placed on the bank of a river or a village pond, often the filthiest, most stagnant body of water available. The condemned woman would be strapped into the chair, her arms and legs bound. Then the beam would be operated, plunging her backwards into the cold, murky water, fully submerging her before she was raised, gasping, only to be plunged back in again, and again, and again. Like the bridle, the ducking stool was a punishment for perceived social transgressions rather than serious crimes. It was a common punishment for scolds and brawling women. It was also notoriously used on female brewers who produced a bad batch of ale, or bakers who sold a dishonest loaf of bread. The duration and frequency of the ducks were at the discretion of the magistrate, turning the punishment into a terrifying game of chance. Each immersion brought the risk of drowning. In the colder months, the repeated shock of icy water could lead to hypothermia and death. And even if the woman survived, she would have ingested polluted water, running the risk of contracting deadly diseases like cholera or typhoid. The ducking stool also holds a darker connection to another form of gendered persecution, the witch trials. In some cases, it was adapted for the ordeal by water, a method used to prove if a woman was a witch. The logic was as perverse as it was deadly. The accused would be thrown into the water. Since witches were believed to have rejected the sacrament of baptism, the holy water of the river would supposedly reject them in turn, causing them to float. A woman who floated was thus proven to be a witch, and would be taken out to be executed, usually by burning. A woman who sank was considered innocent. Her name would be cleared, but she would often have already drowned. It was a perfect, closed system of execution, where innocence and guilt led to the same fatal outcome. It was a legal and theological machine that turned a woman's body into a battleground for superstition, where survival was the ultimate proof of damnation. However, the authorities did not always need elaborate iron and wood contraptions to inflict devastating punishments. Sometimes, the most effective tools were shame and social exclusion, wielded with surgical precision. For a crime like adultery, which was seen as a threat to the entire social fabric of male property and lineage, the punishments were designed to permanently mark a woman as a social outcast. A common punishment across Europe was the public penance walk. The adulterous woman, and often her partner, would be forced to march through the town, sometimes stripped to their undergarments, barefoot, their heads shaved to remove a key aspect of their feminine identity. They would be led to the church doors, where they would be forced to publicly confess their sin before the entire congregation. In some regions, this was taken even further. The woman might be forced to wear a specific symbol of her crime, like the famous scarlet letter of later Puritan lore. The goal was to transform her body into a living billboard advertising her sin. This wasn't a punishment that ended after a few hours. A shaved head took months or years to grow back. The memory of the community was long. The shame of that walk, of that public confession, would follow her for the rest of her life, affecting her marriage prospects, her economic opportunities, and her social standing. It was a social death. In a small, tightly knit community where reputation was everything, to be branded as a fallen woman was to be condemned to a life of isolation and contempt. The pain of the lash or the sting of the stocks would fade, but the wound of public shame would never truly heal. It was a life sentence served outside of prison walls, a clear demonstration that for women, the loss of honor was considered a fate as dreadful as the loss of life itself. The bridle, the stool, the shaming walk, these were the tools, the physical hardware of oppression. They were brutal, tangible, and terrifyingly effective. But to truly understand the nightmare, we must look beyond the iron and wood. We must examine the architecture of the prison itself. The most powerful and inescapable torture device of the medieval world was not a physical object. It was an invisible machine, an intricate system of ideas, meticulously constructed over centuries from the gears of law, the pistons of medicine, and the divine blueprint of religion. This machine didn't just punish women, it defined them, constrained them, and justified their subjugation at every turn. It was a machine that operated silently, invisibly, inside the minds of an entire civilization. Let us first inspect the legal framework of this machine, the cold, rigid skeleton upon which all other forms of control were built. In the world of medieval and early modern common law, a woman, particularly a married woman, was not a full legal person. She existed in a state known as coverture. The very word is chillingly descriptive. Her legal identity was covered by that of her father, and then upon marriage, by that of her husband. In the eyes of the law, she ceased to exist as an independent individual. The influential English jurist William Blackstone would later summarize this principle with brutal clarity in the 18th century, codifying centuries of tradition. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. Think about the profound implications of this. A woman under coverture could not own property in her own name. Any land, any inheritance, any wages she earned belonged, by law, to her husband. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue or be sued in court on her own behalf. If she was assaulted or slandered, it was her husband who had to bring the case, as he was the one whose property had been damaged. Her body, her labor, her very identity were legally subsumed. This was not a rare or extreme circumstance. This was the default state for the vast majority of women. It was a form of civil death, a complete erasure of individual autonomy. This legal framework created a perfect system of control. How could a woman escape an abusive husband if she had no legal right to her own money or property? How could she seek justice for a crime committed against her if she was not even recognized as an independent plaintiff by the court? The law was not designed to protect her. It was designed to manage her. It turned fathers and husbands into legal wardens, granting them immense power over the women in their lives, including, in many cases, the legal right to inflict moderate physical punishment to ensure obedience. The legal machine didn't need an iron spider to tear at a woman's flesh. It had already stripped her of her personhood, leaving her utterly vulnerable to the whims of the men who legally owned her. Now, let us turn to the second major component of this machine, the science of medicine. If the law erased a woman's legal identity, the medical establishment sought to pathologize her biological nature. The medical theories of the era, inherited from ancient Greek thinkers like Galen and Hippocrates, were built upon a foundation of inherent female inferiority. The female body was seen as a flawed, colder, and moister version of the male's, which made women naturally more emotional, less rational, and prone to all manner of physical and mental weaknesses. Their very biology was presented as a defect. The most infamous and enduring medical concept used to control women was that of hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. For thousands of years, physicians believed that a woman's womb was not a stable, fixed organ. They theorized it was a free-floating, almost animal-like entity within her body. When a woman was deprived of regular sexual intercourse, it was believed her womb would become light and dry, and would begin to wander throughout her body in search of moisture, pressing on other organs and causing a terrifying array of symptoms. If it pressed on the heart, it caused anxiety and palpitations. If it rose to the throat, it caused a feeling of suffocation, known as globus hystericus. If it reached the brain, it caused seizures, irrational behavior, and madness. The treatments for this wandering womb were as bizarre as the diagnosis. They ranged from placing foul-smelling substances under a woman's nose to drive the womb downwards, to applying pleasant-smelling unguents to her thighs to lure it back into place. This medical theory was an incredibly powerful tool of social control. Any form of female behavior that men found undesirable or difficult to manage, intellectual ambition, artistic passion, sexual desire, depression, or simple defiance, could be easily dismissed as a medical symptom. She wasn't a thinking person with valid grievances, she was simply hysterical. Her mind wasn't her own. It was being held hostage by a rogue organ. This scientific framework provided a convenient, authoritative justification for ignoring, silencing, and institutionalizing women who refused to conform to the narrow expectations of female passivity. The medical machine worked in perfect harmony with the legal one, providing a biological reason for the social subjugation the law enforced. But the most powerful and unassailable cog in this invisible machine, the one that provided the divine justification for all the others, was religion. The theological interpretation of women's nature, woven into the very fabric of medieval Christian society, was the engine that powered the entire system. The foundational narrative was the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden. For centuries, theologians and priests interpreted this story not as a complex allegory, but as the ultimate proof of woman's inherent nature. Eve was the one who was first deceived by the serpent. She was the one who disobeyed God and tempted Adam to do the same. Therefore, all women, as her daughters, inherited her weaknesses. They were more susceptible to temptation, morally frailer, more carnal, and fundamentally less trustworthy than men. This interpretation was not a fringe belief, it was mainstream dogma, repeated in sermons and written in influential texts by the Church Fathers. Tertullian, an early Christian author, famously addressed women as the devil's gateway, blaming them for the fall of man and the death of Christ. This theological framework cast woman not as a partner, but as a potential spiritual hazard, a source of temptation that men must constantly guard against and control for their own salvation. The patriarchal structure of society, man as the head of the household, woman as his subordinate, was not presented as a social construct, but as a divine, unchangeable order ordained by God Himself. This religious machine reached its most murderous potential during the great European witch hunts, which raged from the 15th to the 18th centuries. It is no coincidence that the vast majority of those accused, tortured, and executed as witches were women. The logic of the witch hunters was built directly upon this foundation of theological misogyny. Women who existed outside of direct male control, independent widows who owned property, poor spinsters who lived alone, were immediately suspect. Women who possessed traditional knowledge of the natural world, midwives who delivered babies, herbalists who could heal sickness, folk healers who understood the community's ailments, were seen as a direct threat. Their knowledge, passed down through generations of women, operated outside the control of the male-dominated church and the nascent male medical profession. It was a simple, brutal act of rebranding. Their healing was recast as demonic magic, their wisdom as diabolical pacts. The witch hunts can be seen as a systematic, brutal campaign to destroy female knowledge, eradicate female autonomy, and violently enforce a patriarchal, theological order. It was the machine's ultimate weapon, a holy war against the independent woman, justified by God Himself. Law provided the procedure. Superstition provided the hysteria. But it was religion that provided the ultimate, unshakable justification for the slaughter. Our investigation began in the lurid glow of a museum exhibit, with the cold, spiked form of a ghost forged from iron. We started with the breast ripper, an instrument of such perfect theatrical cruelty that it has haunted our collective imagination for centuries. We have now journeyed through the quiet archives of history, through the dry text of ancient laws and the disturbing theories of forgotten medicine. We have seen that the phantom we came to investigate was in fact a decoy, a Hamasitvani, a myth. But its non-existence does not absolve the past. Instead, it reveals a far more chilling truth. The myth of the iron spider has persisted with such incredible strength for one simple, unsettling reason. It is convenient. It is a convenient lie. It allows us to neatly package a vast, complex, and systematic history of misogyny into a single, horrifying object. We can look at the iron claw, shudder at its barbarism, and feel a sense of righteous distance. It allows us to blame a few sadistic torturers in a dark dungeon, rather than confronting the architects of the prison itself. The lawmakers, the doctors, the theologians, the very foundations of Western civilization. The breast ripper is a scapegoat. It takes the blame for an entire system, letting the real and far more insidious mechanisms of oppression fade into the background. The truth we have uncovered is much more difficult to stomach. The real horror was not an exceptional act of bloody violence, but the mundane, daily, legal, and spiritual subjugation of half the population. The real torture device was not a set of iron claws, but an invisible machine of ideas that ensnared women from the moment they were born. The scold's bridle was not an anomaly. It was the logical endpoint of a society that believed a woman's voice was a form of disorder. The ducking stool was not just a bizarre punishment. It was the physical manifestation of a worldview that saw female defiance as a sickness needing a violent cure. The legal doctrine of coverture was not a dusty footnote. It was the operating system of patriarchy, erasing female identity with the stroke of a pen. The medical diagnosis of hysteria was not a simple mistake. It was a scientific weapon used to invalidate female experience. The witch hunts were not a moment of collective madness. They were a calculated war on female autonomy and knowledge, justified by divine mandate. The iron spider, the phantom at the heart of our story, may be a product of the imagination, but the ideas that gave it imagined life, the fear of the female voice, the obsession with controlling the female body, the weaponization of shame, the belief in woman's inherent inferiority, those were terrifyingly real. They were the invisible spikes, the intangible shackles. The most effective torture device in history was never made of metal. It was made of ideas. And that forces us to ask one final, crucial question. How many of those ideas have we truly melted down and reforged? Or do they still exist, quieter now, more sophisticated, but present in the architecture of our own modern world? The bridle may no longer be made of iron, but have we not found new ways to silence women who speak out of turn? The legal fiction of coverture may be gone, but has the struggle for true economic and legal equality really ended? The witch hunts are over, but has the suspicion of powerful women truly been extinguished? The ghost of the breast ripper teaches us a final, vital lesson. It is easy to condemn the monsters of the past, especially when we invent them to be as grotesque as possible. It is much harder and much more important to recognize the monstrous ideas that we have allowed to survive. Thank you for joining this investigation. If you believe that history's buried truths need to be unearthed, subscribe and join our community. Comment below with your thoughts. What other historical phantoms do you think are hiding a more disturbing reality? By remembering the real machine, not just the iron ghost, we arm ourselves against its echoes in the present, and we ensure that its work is never, ever finished again.